Hello again. Welcome to episode 4 of Red Talks, the Talk Socialism podcast. I'm your host, Connor Hodgson-Bruniker. We don't have any Max today. He's revising for a history exam. Today, I'm joined by Michael Lloyd, who is a professional economist at the Global Policy Institute and an advisor to the Labour Party at the national level. Hello, Michael.
Hello there, Connor.
So today we're going to be discussing the Labour Party Manifesto, which came out yesterday as we speak. And we're going to be focusing particularly on the economic side of things, so the National Investment Bank, renationalisation, and public services, because Michael's an economist. So I guess to start, we'll ask you specifically on the investment bank, what is it, how will it operate, and what is its function and role?
Well, the idea of the National Investment Bank is essentially the same, similar to the one which already exists in Germany, for instance.
Yes.
KfW, the State Investment Bank, which has existed since 1948 and exists to support both German business, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, and also to develop infrastructure and environmental cladding and stuff like that, environmental in terms of houses, etc. So a variety of objectives, but essentially the aim is to provide long-term funding for these areas and long-term funding for business, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. Whereas in this country, it is pretty much impossible for businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, whether they're startups or even businesses that have, say, 20 million turnover, have been in existence for 5 to 10 years, to get loans from commercial banks.
So it's, in a sense, its purpose is to overcome the short-termism of our financial sector and that sort of short-term dividend maximizing and share price maximizing culture that we have, particularly in Britain, but the Anglophone countries generally, because this is a thing in the US as well, and to move us towards the sorts of investment culture they have in places like Germany and the Nordic countries.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Exactly, there you go. So in terms of how it will operate in terms of raising its finances and its capital, and how it will then invest them, and how that capital will get distributed to businesses, and who will decide that sort of investment, who will decide where the investment goes, basically.
Well, first of all, it will operate independently of government. It will be subject to a mandate, which will obviously be provided by a Labour government in terms of the broad policy objectives and the areas that it's intended for it to be used for. But the initial funding of something like 20 billion will be by government, initial government bond issue to the bank. Thereafter, over the lifetime of the bank, which we hope will continue forever, effectively, but let's assume 10 years for the moment, just a 10-year horizon. And there, what will happen is the first 20 billion will be funded by a government bond issue, so that will count against government debt. Thereafter, as with KfW in Germany, there will be bond issues by the National Investment Bank itself. Now, those bond issues will be guaranteed by the government.
Okay.
Doesn't necessarily have to be a formal guarantee, but there will be an implicit guarantee by the government, so that as with KfW has a 3A's rating, which is better than Britain's current rating, actually, in terms of bond markets. So you can, as I said, the National Investment Bank would then fund itself at say another, well, however much it wants, but say 10, 20 billion a year. That would not count against government net debt. That's the important thing. So it will not, you can't be accused, the Tories can't accuse you of actually increasing the national debt, because it won't. The reason for that is because the bank will operate independently of government, although in fact the supervisory board will be a twin board structure, will have the Secretary of State for Industry as the chair, etc. But because it's a financial intermediary, it will not lend directly to companies. Companies will be lent to by individual banks, hopefully cooperative banks, which will be set up across all the regions, because there will be regional branches of the National Investment Bank. There won't be separate entities, they will be part of the National Investment Bank.
Fair enough.
Reason for that is because we don't really want one region suddenly to go bust or something, because it makes very bad investment. No, not that that's likely to happen, but nevertheless. There are lots of small banks already setting up now. Many of them are digital banks, because you don't need the kind of legacy costs that the current commercial banks have, and you don't necessarily need enormous branches. I mean, in this region, obviously, you have Atom as a digital bank, and there are others around, but there are lots of cooperative banks being set up. There is one, for instance, in Airdrie in Scotland. Another one is being set up in Southampton. We want to see these set up around the region. So these will be the banks, as in Germany, that lend to the companies. The role of the investment bank, the National Investment Bank, is to provide considerably bonified interest rates to these banks who are lending. So in fact, you would cut the rate at which loans are issued by about 50%, which is substantial. And they would be, as again they are in Germany, 20, 30-year loans. So, I mean, you will not get anywhere near, I mean, you'll be lucky in the UK, if you're a small and medium-sized business, to get a 3-year loan. That's the maximum you'll get. And generally, funding is by overdraft funding, which is basically for working capital. Trouble is, companies, particularly smaller ones, tend to use that funding, the overdraft funding, for investment, and then they get moaned at by the banks because they're using it for that. But that's because the banks will not provide you a loan unless, if you're a small company, or even a medium-sized company for that matter, you put up your own house as collateral. So, you know, this is not really business lending at all in the way that it is in other countries. And not just Germany, it's Italy, Scandinavian countries, France, etc.
So there's a few points I'd like to pick up on there. So going back a few minutes, you basically said, so because it's an independent bank, I mean, it's supervised by the government and the state, but it's independent of them in terms of its own internal affairs and how it invests. And therefore, its issuing of bonds won't count towards the national debt. If, as you say, it's all of this debt, all of this issuing of bonds is implicitly guaranteed by the state, could the Conservatives and people on the right not just go, well, that is just a way for Labour and the left to hide debt when they're still doing spending? I can see that being a political attack they would use.
Well, they could, but it would be particularly stupid. As it doesn't happen in Germany, where you have you've had right-wing governments.
Yeah, but Germany is a significantly more rational country than Britain, to be fair.
That's true. But don't forget, it's not just the bonds. That's how you fund the National Investment Bank. But the loans themselves are not made directly by the National Investment Bank. So the reasons why their loans and why their activity and why their funding by a bond issue will not count against the national debt is because they are operating independently of government, and they are operating as a financial intermediary, not a bank that is itself directly making loans.
All right then. And the second point I would like to come back on was when you said the National Investment Bank and its regional branches won't themselves be directing the investment. They'll instead be an intermediary to loan to financial institutions, to then people can go to those institutions to borrow. Say you were trying to set up a business and you couldn't get a loan under the current financial system, and we introduced the National Investment Bank to facilitate that, how would you be sure from the investment bank's point of view that when you give your loans to other financial institutions that they will actually direct that investment in an appropriate way into things that are actually, things that we want to be investing in, essentially.
Because the criteria will be set, and there'll be various programs that the National Investment Bank runs in terms of business, in terms of infrastructure, particularly local infrastructure, and also environmental infrastructure. So there will be some control in terms of the programs that are run. So any bid would have to be within the context of those programs.
Yeah, this does seem rather, I don't know, complex. Would it not be more straightforward for the investment bank itself just to direct investments rather than go through an intermediary financial institution?
The problem with that, of course, is you will definitely get challenged because you're competing directly with commercial banks. Now there are two problems there. I don't particularly have a problem with competing against private commercial banks. However, there is a problem. There would be challenges. There's no question about that. The other thing is, would that actually make any real change in the nature of funding? Because since you've got public banks, therefore, which wouldn't be in themselves large, they would be established within a framework of banking, and the culture of banking and the culture of lending is so short term and so linked to asset-based finance and share financing, equity financing, rather than long-term loan funding, that it wouldn't actually change the nature of how you fund businesses and how you fund infrastructure, which is what we really want to do, to take a long-term view.
Okay, fair enough. I guess this kind of moves us on towards financial sector and what we want to do with regards to that. I haven't actually had a chance to read the full manifesto yet because it only came out yesterday, and I didn't read anything on the financial sector. So, do you know anything the party's planning to do? And if you don't, what would be an ideal situation to have in terms of introducing financial regulations? Like, I know you and I have talked about the idea of bringing what's its face, the Banking Act of 1933. What's it called? From FDR, the one that separated commercial and investment banks.
Oh, you mean
well, I can't remember this.
I can't remember either.
Dodd-Frank is
the Dodd-Frank is the new one.
Glass-Steagall, that's the one.
Yeah, Glass-Steagall, that's right. Yes, this separation of two things. First of all, I haven't read the manifesto in detail, but the Glass-Steagall structural separation was a separation between investment banks and retail banks. Retail banks are normal banks like Lloyd.
Yeah, you deposit and you save your money with them.
That's right. Investment banks used to be banks that simply advise companies on mergers and acquisitions. Now they engage in securitization and all sorts of fancy financial instruments which make them quite a lot of money. And in fact, I gave evidence for the Global Policy Institute to the commission which was set up looking at banking in the UK a few years ago. And what I suggested was there should be a clear structural separation between retail banks and investment banks. And if investment banks failed, they went to the wall. Retail banking, you will need to support that, as we did when the global financial crash arrived, because otherwise the whole system collapses. People can't get any money.
If people can't get money, then they can't buy things.
No,
then demand collapses and everything goes tits up.
But you should have that structural separation. The commission chickened out on that. They didn't accept my proposal. There were other people supporting it as well. They went for this idea of ring fencing. There's a sort of...
That's a very centrist, middle of the road sounding phrase.
There are going to be holes in the fence. That is absolutely clear.
Instead, we should build a wall, a big, beautiful wall.
Well, a wall would be better. Well, a wall is what I wanted, not a fence. And I wanted a solid brick wall. But the ring fence will have holes in it which will be exploited, and therefore you'll have jobs for lawyers on both sides of the fence, working for banks on the one hand and regulators on the other, and it will not work. That I'm pretty convinced
and
of.
another thing that I always think of when thinking about finance is that I often hear people talking about 2008 as a failure of regulation. I mean, I don't agree with that analysis, but I can see where they're coming from in terms of the financial instruments that were created in the preceding 30 years. By that point, it become so complex in terms of how many mortgages they'd spliced up and put together and missold as AAA when actually they're all junk and terrible, and no one's ever going to pay those mortgages back. In terms of the regulation, would it not be easier in order to actually reduce regulatory complexity and also to stabilize the financial system by removing a large portion of these sorts of very high risk financial instruments by simply basically getting rid of all of these instruments? And I mean, I don't know if you could ban them. I don't think that would actually work. You could probably use the state to just buy them all up and then cancel them off, or something along those lines. Would it be more effective just to get rid of these sorts of instruments?
I think there's a problem because you don't want to prevent some financial innovation. I mean, the best financial innovation in the banking sector has been the hole in the wall. Actually, that is actually very beneficial to be able to go and get money out of the hole in the wall. But no, going back to the point you're raising, you're quite right. The problem with the sort of regulation we have is that it gets very complex. And there's always regulation arbitrage, i.e. you go and get around it in other ways, in various ways. There is a form of regulation along the lines that you're suggesting, which wouldn't actually ban new products, but what it would do is, as you have with drugs, they would have to be licensed. So you actually, the state does have the ability to regulate, and it regulates on the basis that this is a particularly useless variation of whatever the financial instrument is, and therefore you don't have a license to do it. So you can control in that way, and that would be perfectly possible. And some people have suggested that.
I mean, it makes perfect sense, and I think any rational person would pass legislation basically saying if you're going to innovate and create a new financial instrument in whatever fashion it is, that it needs to have like a trial period to make sure it doesn't collapse the economy. Because I mean, you don't unleash pharmaceutical products or like agrochemicals or whatever on the environment and on the health of the population without testing them quite extensively first. But we don't do that with finance for reasons ?
I think I think the problem was, if you go back to the global financial crash, then the reasons why that actually occurred are relatively complex, but they're not that complex, because essentially what happened was you have all these fancy financial instruments, this slicing, layering of products. So you have I don't know, somebody's mortgage in North Carolina, somebody else's insurance policy in Germany, all bundled together. And the point is that nobody knew what would happen if one element of that suddenly across these various instruments had a problem. As happened, the trigger was the mortgage situation in the States. And because in the States you can walk away from your house and walk away from your mortgage. It's not quite the same here. You can't do that. And therefore, they were clearly, because the Bush administration had pushed the idea of everybody can be a house owner. I've heard that somewhere else somehow. Property-owning democracy. Somebody
once said that.
Something mentioned that.
Not a big historical figure.
And and this is the problem, was that globally these products were held by all sorts of organizations, a lot of shadow banking institutions. Shadow banking still is about a third of the total financial sector.
What do we mean by shadow banking?
We mean like hedge funds, people that are not regulated, actually. They don't come under the normal banking regulation.
Okay.
You could bring them under the banking regulation. There's no reason why you shouldn't. And they usually have some contact with the banking sector in some way or another. Obviously, they have money and they tend to put it somewhere, even though they may move it around. So you're in a situation where we were in a situation where everybody thought it was a good idea to spread risk, which is what you were doing. Actually, both within these instruments and across the whole the whole panoply of instruments globally. What they forgot was that the trouble is, because nobody knew what their exposure was, if something happened, it would spread like
mass contagion.
And the networks themselves, what people forget is it's a bit like the internet. The internet is not, a set of workers' cooperatives, as it were. It's not a network in the normal sense of it. It has large nodes, and the global financial network has large nodes. Now, some of those nodes, Lehman Brothers is an obvious example. AIG, which wasn't allowed to go down, was the insurance company. It tended to impact on these, and then you have a systemic collapse. So had the global financial sector been a full network, a proper network where one node doesn't dominate, or a few nodes don't dominate, but that's not the nature of most networks as it happens.
Fair enough. Would it not be a good idea, therefore, just to essentially bring almost all of just the entire financial sector under public ownership, in terms of both of a sort, so not necessarily direct, traditional bureaucrats running a nationalized industry sort of thing. So if we go along the lines of the Glass-Steagall, separate the investment and the retail, you could have retail banks being in the public sector in terms of cooperative or municipal banks run by local authorities or something like that, and then investment banking done by the state. Would that not be a simpler way to solve financial problems? Because if the state is doing it, and if you have this separation, then there isn't the rationale for, or at least I wouldn't think there would be the rationale for investing in high-risk things that would undermine your economy overall.
I think there are a few problems there. I mean, obviously, with the National Investment Bank and with the aim to set up cooperative and savings banks in the regions, smaller ones, as they have in Germany. I mean, you have an enormous number of savings banks and cooperative banks in Germany. But so eventually, with the National Investment Bank, you would be moving towards this. Now, the more those are cooperative, the more and that can be local authority banks as well. It could be some of the larger credit unions, but I think credit unions have a different function. I sometimes worry that one mustn't confuse the immense advantages, in my view, of credit unions for people who don't have massive amounts of money, don't have high incomes, but can actually collectively work together to enable them to have credit when they need it. But going back to your suggestion about the public sector, I did many years ago in relation to a book that was produced by the Conference of Socialist Economists that I was a member of in the late 1970s, early 1980s, did suggest that we should nationalise the financial sector. Nothing else. You wouldn't need to nationalise anything else. Now, I don't think that's practical politics anymore, and that's the problem. We can gradually move towards that situation, I think. And that, I think, is what we should try to aim at. But as you know, I've always taken the view that you need to be revolutionary in terms of ideas and evolutionary in terms of how you change things. Revolutions never work. In fact, revolutions rarely actually occur. And when they do, they tend not to be very pleasant in the immediate aftermath. Well, the immediate aftermath's fine, but then a few months or years down the line, they don't work very well. So the change needs to be evolutionary. But you've got to have behind it the idea of where you're going. And that's where the revolutionary ideas come in.
Yeah, because if you wanted to do it evolutionary, rather than just seizing all of the assets and sending people on boats across the channel, we could. I mean, we already have RBS in public ownership. to a certain extent. I'm not sure if they've fully sold it back off again, have they?
No,
No.
not yet.
So it's still in public ownership. But the financial sector does tend to get itself into crashes, and it will probably need to be rescued again. So whenever that next occurs, and I'm presuming it will occur at some point because this is the history of capitalism, then when we, bail out the banks, just keep them in public ownership and just amalgamate them into a single bank. Because we once had a conversation about how what the dangerous part of financial crashes is not individual banks collapsing, but the interbank lending market not being able to stabilize things. But if you amalgamated them all into one financial institution, would that not be better?
Well, I think, no, but I think there's a difference here. The interbank lending market and the role of the central bank in that is to ensure that there is a payment settlement system between the banks and that works. I mean, that's absolutely necessary. If you have, and even if you had, if all the current commercial banks were owned by state banks, you'd still have to have some payment settlement system, simply because the way things operate, that people borrow from one bank, pay money into another, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a separate issue. That concerns liquidity, actually.
Okay.
So there's a difference between liquidity and balance sheet problems. Problem with the global financial crash was it was a balance sheet problem. Now, actually, the way banks do their accounts, ironically, they become insolvent on balance sheet temporarily in pretty well every year, just the way they happen to do their accounts. But it resolves itself. But clearly, in terms of the global financial crash, it wasn't going to resolve itself. It was a massive balance sheet insolvency problem, which is why the taxpayers, we as taxpayers, had to actually fund the bank to repair their balance sheets, and why, to some extent, quantitative easing has actually helped them repair those balance sheets. The trouble is, it's gone beyond that, so they've now started simply investing, as have pension funds and insurance companies, in shares to an extent that shares are increasing in value, but nothing else is increasing in value.
I suppose, retrospectively, looking back at what was done in 2008, 2009, with the Troubled Asset Relief Programme and similar things in Europe and so on, that while, yes, it did repair the financial sector, that might not have actually been a good thing, because the financial sector is not really any different to how it was pre-2008. It still makes hugely risky investments, and it still gambles with all of our money. It's still the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer and so on. Would it not, had we gone in the opposite direction and had states basically said, okay, we will bail out people with mortgages and people with debt and private debt, rather than the financial institutions that the debt was owed to, and allowed those financial institutions either to collapse or to be replaced by some other institutions that might have come out of, so new banks replacing old banks, because the principle of the market is supposed to be let the inefficient ones collapse and so on and so forth, although I don't actually agree with the logic of the market. I'm not an expert on what happened in Iceland, but it seems a lot of people mention, oh, Iceland let the banks collapse and now they're doing all right. What do you think of that sort of... I know it's sort of contra history, but yeah.
Well, I don't think Iceland is doing all that well if you look at the level of unemployment, etc. In other words, it hasn't been that successful. The problem with Iceland is, even more than the UK, the growth of the financial sector was so enormous that it dwarfed the economy. I mean, in the UK, we were 5 times, the financial sector was, by assets, 5 times larger than GDP in the UK, and it was even more so in Iceland. Iceland's very small.
Yeah, I've been. It's only got 300,000 people living there, which is like less than the city population of Newcastle.
I mean, I think the reason's suggestion of bailing out the individuals involved, don't forget there'd be small companies involved as well, and they weren't necessarily the sort of thing people you would want to bail out. But I mean, in fact, there are still some bad loans on some held by some banks actually that are still there, because the loan to value is still out of kilter, because values have not increased sufficiently. So you've got a bigger loan than you have asset value in terms of selling it off. That's because there was a tendency for companies to be set up deliberately to actually build, I don't know, office blocks and
Yeah.
factory estates and stuff like this, which
Look, you just drive through cities and you find a lot of these early 2000s buildings which are built as like large, fancy buildings with lots of glass and very posh looking. I'm just like, this building has no purpose. Why is it here? And it's just empty. It sits empty with like to let signs on the front. It's just like no one can ever use this because like it doesn't do anything.
No, but the companies who set those up just went bankrupt. Went into liquidation, and the asset therefore was transferred to the bank. That finished up with a loan that it couldn't collect because the company had disappeared, and an asset value which was much lower than they wanted. So they've been waiting for the asset value to increase. Same thing is true in Spain. If you look at the amount of construction that was done there, or even there's one airport that was built and no planes have ever flown. And that was partly also because you had, and this is a bit of a warning, you did have corruption in terms of regional governments.
This happens.
So it does happen.
All right then. I don't know if there's anything else we could talk about on the financial sector at this point.
Because I mean, again, I haven't looked at it, but there appears to be the suggestion of a financial transaction tax.
Yes, that.
Yeah,
Which it's my understanding that they had that in the United States until the 1960s, didn't they?
Sweden had one as well. Except then about half of their people suddenly decamped to to London as a result of introducing the financial. I'm not a fan of financial transaction tax. I understand why it's being done. I think there's an alternative, which is the financial activities tax, which is much easier to deal with. It doesn't actually involve capital flight. Then people wouldn't sort of move their operations and their transactions, or the base of their transactions. It wouldn't involve double, triple, sometimes quadruple taxation, because that's the problem with transactions. There isn't just one transaction, there's a whole series of transactions. You get taxed on each one. A financial activities tax, effectively, because don't forget, banks don't pay VAT. Financial institutions don't pay VAT. What you're doing is bringing in a financial activities tax, which would be a tax on wages and profits. Although the two elements, the profits there'd be a higher tax on the profits, because quite often the profit is abnormal. I mean, you can argue all profits are abnormal, but
profits,
super profits. So you have a financial activities tax, which in effect is a kind of value-added tax for banks. Now that is easy to collect.
How would it apply also to wages and to financial assets?
Because value-added tax does.
I'm actually against value-added tax. I don't like VAT because it's horribly regressive.
No, it isn't actually. If you look, it isn't actually. There's a nice IFS paper, which looks at it. If you take post-tax income, then you find it actually isn't as aggressive as you think. It's a bit of a shibboleth that the left has always had in the UK about value-added tax, that somehow it's regressive. When you look at it carefully, it actually isn't that regressive. But I mean, what we're talking about here is applying it where it doesn't apply, effectively applying it to the financial sector, and that would raise quite a lot of money. It can't be evaded, and it will reduce the size of the financial sector, which the financial transaction tax won't do. And that's what we need to do, is to reduce the size of the financial sector.
Fair enough. I suppose with that we can move on to parts of the real economy in terms of the Labour Manifesto has announced that it's seeking to renationalise not just the railways, which we've been talking about for years, but also energy companies in terms of setting up public energy companies to compete with private energy companies, and also public ownership of the water. I would have liked to have seen a lot more, but it's a nice start. What do you think of these renationalising ideas, basically?
Yes, because it's a start.
Yeah.
As you say, it's a start towards moving to a position where the state provision, public supply is the norm, and the private sector has a much smaller part of the economy. I mean, some Labour spokespeople seem to be worried about sort of, saying that this is an increase in the it's an enlargement of the state role. I'm not. I think it's a good thing.
That would be a positive thing,
and it should be celebrated. So it's a start. I mean, I think what will happen, and if you look carefully at the proposals on the national grid, and I suspect the proposals on water are the same, and to some extent energy, we will increase the tightness of regulation quite substantially. I mean, I think in terms of the national grid, the idea is to separate the operating license from the capital, the physical capital, and therefore
so you mean the actual infrastructure?
Yes, that's right.
So like the pylons and the waterways and the pipes and so on.
Now, if you do that, you tighten the regulation. Then eventually the impact of that, if the regulation is tight enough, and it needs to be far, far tighter, is to reduce the value, the share value of these private companies on the market, which would make it much easier if you wanted eventually then to take over the capital assets, to be able to buy them without breaking the public bank, as it were.
Yeah. In terms of how these renationalised industries are actually going to operate on like a day-to-day business model, I haven't read it in too much detail, and actually the parts that I did read didn't seem to go in much detail in the manifesto, but John McDonnell at his new economics conference in Newcastle, and I'm sure he'll have said it at his other conferences, said we don't want to go back to the old nationalisation of the post-war period. We don't want state monopolies with state bureaucrats and civil servants running everything without any regard for profitability and operating costs and so on. What we want is them to be financially viable so that they're actually competitive, and also to be participatory and democratic. And I think he was trying to get to saying some form of co-determination or some form of municipal pseudo-cooperative economics, in terms of, because it's not just trains, they are planning public ownership of the buses, and it's my understanding that in terms of buses, in each locality, in each city or county or whatever, there will be different municipally owned buses with I would presume both the local authorities and the bus drivers and like people who take buses regularly, and could be members like they are with Co-op Bank or whatever like that, and then they all get to have some semblance of input, probably to differential levels, on how the services are run. Is that approaching reality?
Well, it's not entirely clear.
It's not the clearest
what is being proposed. I have to say, clearly, I mean, if you take the buses for the moment, we're working sort of backwards to what John said. In terms of the buses, you clearly need regulation, obviously.
Obviously, because they keep putting my bus tickets up.
and in my view, you don't need private bus companies. I don't see any reason for
German-owned bus companies.
Private companies at all. Well, in fact, if you look at other countries, although there's been a lot of suggestion this is a massive shift to the left.
It's really not. This is centrist policy.
It's absolutely, because this is not the revolution. It's not even.
I mean, we're not coming to seize your buses by force of arms.
No, and in many other countries, you have public provision of these sort of services. I mean, the rail system in Germany works perfectly well.
Very nice.
It's publicly owned. All rail employees are civil servants. Now, I don't have a problem with that, and I don't see why we should worry about that at all. I mean, obviously, with the rail system, it's a kind of creeping nationalisation as the franchises come up, they'll be taken into public ownership. Network Rail is effectively publicly owned anyway. And although it still needs, I think, better regulation, and clearly when you have public companies running the trains, then they can link clearly with Network Rail. There should be a much better relationship with them. I don't see. Going back to what John said, I disagree about this idea that you can't go back or somehow that it's old-fashioned to have publicly owned companies running, and somehow they would be inefficient because they're they're not. No, they're not in other countries, and they don't need to be.
I agree with the argument about inefficiency. I think the thing that concerns me with going back to the sort of classic model of nationalisation is that it's problematic in terms of longevity. So if you renationalise in the old model, it's directly under the control of the state, and ultimately the state can sell it off again if it wants to. And at some point in the future, the Conservatives will probably be back in government, and then they'll try and privatise it again. So it's not really a permanent solution. It's more of a we'll do this so long as we're in power.
Yes and no. I mean, obviously, as I said, I want an evolutionary. I want evolutionary change. That means that you have evolutionary change with a kind of ratchet. So you don't have. I mean, Thatcher was an anomaly in more than one senses, but she was an anomaly in the sense that suddenly what was a consensus was totally overthrown. Now, in no other country did that happen, actually. And don't forget, you have a substantial public monopolies still in the US, actually, and you certainly have in other countries.
Even the Americans have public railways.
So that's right. So the UK was an outlier and a bit odd. So the Thatcher Revolution was unique in one sense, and we need. And
I mean, the same sort of thing happened in Eastern Europe with shock therapy, post-Soviet collapse sort of thing.
Yes, that's true, which was deliberately sponsored by the US. That's absolutely true. And look at the disaster that's occurred because of that. Yeah, it
destroyed life expectancy, destroyed living standards.
So I think we can gradually move. I mean, as I think I've indicated before when we've spoken, I'm also a federalist. I want to see genuine federalism from local to global. That does not mean centralisation. That's
the opposite. Decentralisation.
It's exactly the opposite. I know the discussion in the UK tends to see it as centralisation. It isn't. It's exactly the opposite. It's decentralisation, maximum decentralisation, so that you control as much as you can at local level. You only move up to regional level, then national level, then supranational level, and then global level for those activities and functions which need to be regulated at those differing levels. Now, that's also true if you, in terms of the public provision of goods and services, and remembering that as we're moving towards an economy which is going to be dominated by services. In fact, much of our GDP, certainly in
it already does come from services.
Already comes from services. And although some Tories will suggest that the health service should be run privately, we don't agree with that.
That would be horrible.
And there is creeping privatisation, creeping marketisation, and that's really a problem. Direct public provision can be efficient. It need not. This idea that somehow. The suggestion that somehow the government is running it. The government's not running it. You clearly have boards on public companies, and they will have a situation where they have to maximise their revenue and minimise their costs, and the surplus which they will generate should be used for investment. Now that is the norm, because it's a public body. Then that public investment should be appropriate to the needs of those organisations. I mean, you'll need a degree of oversight generally at national level, and then broadly. But that's the situation. So I don't see a problem with running organisations not for any kind of profit. You still try to generate a surplus because you need that for investment. And that's true of the whole economy. That's the whole point.
And I mean, nationalisation doesn't itself actually fundamentally change capitalism. It's not transitioning to a different system as of yet, because you're still, you'd still exploit. I mean, the Marxist the Marxist jargon is essentially you are still exploiting workers to create surplus value, which you then appropriate, and they are separate from the workers because it's not the same group of people. But state provision is definitely preferable because the state is at least somewhat accountable to the people, whereas private private companies are not at all accountable.
I don't agree with Marx, because the state can represent people. The state can be genuinely representative of people. It's a neoliberal fiction that there's an antithesis between the state and society. No, properly interpreted and properly run, the state and society can be viewed as one. People own the state. They need to understand that they own the state. You need a set of structures so they can see that they can influence the way in which the state operates at, as I said, differing levels, because if you have a federal structure, you'll be able, obviously, to have more influence at local level than you will actually. But, society will... I think owning the state is I make the point in the book I've just finished, that's the situation. You need to change our view of what the state is.
The state needs to become genuinely representative of the masses.
Yes.
I'm sure if Max was here, he'd make a reference to Rousseau and the general will, but no, I don't know enough about it.
Yes, he probably would. The problem is that Rousseau's background, of course, since he was Swiss, was the idea of having, because he still lived at a time when you didn't have a modern,
he was pre-capitalist
society. Yeah. That's right. So it's very different now. So the structures will need to be different, but the principle is the same. The principle is that properly viewed, the state is not only representative of society, it actually is society.
Yeah, I think
it's a bit difficult philosophically.
I'm not wholly convinced, but I can see what you're trying to approach towards. And you've read the paper that I wrote, where I wrote about cooperatives and said that in order to make the state genuinely representative, the state, the funding of the state needs to rely heavily or almost entirely upon the success of businesses run by people and for people in a democratic fashion, whether that's directly under the state itself through nationalisation or through, I propose that if you have like private cooperatives that are separate from the state, that rather than pay taxes, they could negotiate with at local authorities for like individual ones, or if they're like a national institution or regional, then with regional and national bodies, a dividend from their profits, so it can be atoned to their own profitability, rather than just applying a blanket tax like we do at the moment.
I think the problem is with the cooperatives is you've got two groups. I mean, they're still people, and in many cases the same people, but they're both workers and consumers. And I think that's always been the problem with cooperatives. The actual cooperative movement, what we know as the cooperative movement, was the consumers.
Largely,
the Rochdale pioneers and etc. The rest of it. And workers' cooperatives have been, so they still exist. They represent,
there's quite a lot of them actually.
Well, they represent about 2% of GDP. So
global GDP or British GDP?
No, British GDP.
Right. It's a lot higher in other parts of the world.
It's higher, but it's not enormous. Like even in Spain,
I know
in
northern Italy, in the region Emilia-Romagna, it's like a third of their entire regional economy. So
yes, that's right.
And in the kibbutz in Israel as well, although they've kind of fallen from grace. And they're in Israel,
that's
and
that's the problem.
Their success is based on expropriation of Palestinian land. So
exactly. So yes, and I'm quite happy to see an expansion of cooperatives. I'm not against cooperatives. I'm just being realistic about what one can do and how you actually get round the differing interests of the consumer and the worker. And that, as I say, is something which you can only do in the context of society and the state, in inverted commas, society representing itself, so that these interests, when they're in conflict, can be resolved.
All right. Shall we move on to public services, and in particular health, social care and education? We'll start with education because
Can we start with health?
Oh, well, okay. We can start with health if you want to talk about health. Go ahead.
Let's start with health, just to be fairly quick. Yes, it's great that the Labour Party is proposing increasing the amount of money to the health service. It still isn't enough, incidentally. It's almost double what the Conservatives are promising, but it's still short of the 4% a year which they actually need. So I'm happy to see a movement in the right direction, but I'd rather have seen more, and I don't quite understand why. Except that they'd have to find somewhere where they're trying to balance the books in terms of tax and spend, which I think is unnecessary.
Yeah, that's a very political motivated thing, because they got the deficit as a valence issue. It's just like, it's really not, but like for politics.
But that is the problem with there's not enough money going into the health service, and I'm not quite sure what's happened on social care either.
I haven't read that section of the manifesto. So.
Yeah, I don't.
Are we?
I don't either.
I know both Corbyn and McDonnell and others in the party have spoken about bringing social care into the NHS, because at the moment, am I right in thinking it's almost entirely privatised, but paid for by the state, but contracted out?
Yes, that's right.
I'm sure they've said in the past that we will basically reverse that and incorporate it into the NHS as a proper public
Yeah, they've
thing.
talked about a kind of national care service and something like that.
Are they planning to reverse marketisation of the NHS and in the internal market?
It's not clear, but I hope they are.
Yeah.
I mean, it represents, it's about 7%, I think, of the total, but it is expanding. I don't think people don't realise this, because, for instance, I mean, I go to Specsavers. Specsavers actually was private. I mean, the whole provision of testing used to be within the health service, and it was privatised. The Specsavers bid for it.
And when the NHS was set up in 1947, it covered everything, or was it 48?
Well, no, it didn't cover it never covered dentists.
I'm sure, did it not?
No, it didn't. And it did. You have the National Health Service funding but they're private dentists, and don't forget, technically, doctors are not employed. GPs, I mean, are not employed directly. Although that doesn't mean they're self-employed consultants, as some Tories will have. They're not. They're entirely funded by them. So I certainly want to see any kind of marketisation. I would like to see the bill, the Lansley Act, repealed and replaced.
Which act was that?
That was the one which introduced the marketisation.
Was this in
back
Thatcher?
in 2011? No. This was 2011.
Oh,
2012.
Was this the Health and Social Care Act of 2012?
Yes. The Health and Social
right.
Care.
Okay.
That was one. I mean, social care was already pretty substantially privatised when that was introduced, and it's pretty well privatised now. There are very few local authority homes left, but of course the money comes from the local authorities, and not enough money is there. That's absolutely clear. Social care is a problem. Social and medical care are the real problem in terms of funding as we go forward, because we have longer lived populations.
Yeah, because we have an ageing population.
Having said that,
decreasing demographics in terms of young people being in work to pay taxes to fund these things. So,
but it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. In the end, it's all about distribution. If the economy is growing, then the argument is how you divide up the cake. Now, it's nice to continue to have growth, at least growth of the good things in life, not necessarily growth. There are certain areas where you don't want to grow. But basically, it's all about distribution. We have enough money to do whatever we want.
Loads
it's a
of
political
money.
choice.
I was at a talk at the University of York where I study, like the week before last, where Professor Guy Standing from SOAS came up to talk about his recent book, The Corruption of Capitalism, and he was talking about he got on to talking about how much money the government loses every year to corporate welfare, which he splits up, and he basically says some of it is like just direct giving money to them in grants for research, some of it is indirect through like subsidising wages through tax credit and so on. And he I can't remember how he did the mathematics, but he got to the figure of £400 billion a year that we lose on corporate welfare, which is the entire NHS budget, the entire education budget.
Well, it's 4 times the health budget.
Yeah, some ridiculous other amount of stuff that we could pay for, and I'm just like, we could get rid of a large portion of that. Actually, we'll come back to public services because I want to talk about education. But on a sort of tangent, he also said that for instance, when we subsidise research for like the pharmaceutical industry or whatever other technologies, we essentially socialise the risk, but they then privatise the gains and they still get to have a monopoly on through patent law on selling the drug or selling whatever copyrighted thing they've invented in inverted commas, when actually that's a massive injustice because the taxpayer paid for it and they are essentially making billions off of it for a period of decades. Professor Standing didn't himself then say we therefore should basically get rid of. He said we should get rid of patent law and make it sort of more marketized, or that's the suggestion I thought he was going towards. I would probably just say, okay, if it's being funded by the taxpayer, then the copyright should be with the government or with the state or with whichever particular part of the state that did the research, and then it can be done for the public good. So if we do pharmaceutical research and we invent a new drug, rather than the NHS having to buy that from a corporation who has a monopoly on it, we should just be able to manufacture that in-house.
I think you're absolutely right. I've for some years now been arguing that one bit of the nationalisation which we should have is that to nationalise, well, in fact, as you quite rightly point out, the Standing did, a fair amount of the research is done.
It's not all done by
no, it's not all done by.
A substantial part of it
is done by public laboratories of various kinds of universities, etc. My view is that all of the research, all of it, should be done by the state, because the state should also set what are the priorities for research. Because remember, if you're running a drug company, you will be dead keen on having those drugs which people use permanently,
rather than developing a cure for cancer, we can sell them lots and lots of things to make the pain go away.
That's a good example. So the state should do all the research. Then what you do is to license the companies simply to produce.
That would make perfect sense. Yeah.
No patents at all. They are licensed to produce the drugs, but the state develops the drugs. And all the pharmaceutical companies are production units.
Ditto other.
Why don't we do it?
Could do,
I mean, you could do that without. It would cost virtually nothing actually to do that. So
we're already paying for most of it. So what difference will it make?
Hopefully, in the next Labour manifesto, whether we're in government or not, we
will just be like, we're going to get rid of all copyright.
So I entirely agree. It's obvious. So some of these things are so obvious. I mean, some of the areas are difficult. This is not a difficult one.
Yeah, so that was an interesting tangent.
We can move on to education.
We'll do that. So education, which I'm particularly happy about the manifesto for, because I'm currently laden with like 45 grand of debt. So I know it's in the manifesto to get rid of tuition fees. I didn't mention anywhere whether they're wanting to retroactively cancel the debts of everyone who has them, which is probably unlikely, but that would be nice. But basically,
the problem,
and higher education as well.
Yeah, the problem, although I don't think fees should have been introduced in the first place, you've got to fund universities. So if you're going to cancel the tuition fees, then obviously you've got to put that money into universities directly. Which is what used to happen.
Taxes for it.
So it's what used to happen, because what's happened with education and with all education, but you look at universities, they've been marketized.
They've been the neoliberal university.
You as a student are a customer. You're a consumer. This is crazy. This is not what education is supposed to be about. So that I'm quite happy to see that go. I'm happy because I think it was also suggested that grants will be brought back.
Maintenance grants would be reintroduced. That's in the.
That's absolutely.
But they're means tested, aren't they?
Yes, they are. They always have been. I mean, even when I went to Cambridge, I got a grant, but it was means tested.
That's fair.
But that's not terribly a problem actually. But they were reasonable anyway. You could manage on them if you didn't drink too much.
It's not alcohol; it's the trains to get to all these lefty meetings. But if we're renationalising the railways,
that's true. Yeah, well, it's all these split campuses all over the place, which create a problem.
That's a thing.
And split school campuses as well, for that matter. I'm quite happy with that. In practice, of course, most students will not pay their their loans back. In effect, what you've got already is a kind of graduate tax. That's really effectively what it is, because the state will have to pick up the tab for those when the students who don't pay, which is most of them, given the appallingly low wages we have in the country anyway. You're not going to earn enough. But the Tories are trying to get around that by not actually increasing the level at which you start paying, the wage level at which you start paying.
At which you start paying tuition fees.
Which
at the moment is 21 grand.
It's 21, but it should be higher than that. And they'll leave it. That's what they'll do. They won't increase it, whatever happens to inflation.
Yeah. And you were talking before about the marketization of the university, and it's not just turning universities into essentially, it's not just turning students into consumers, because a lot of the funding nowadays also comes from universities having investments in rather dodgy companies in the arms industry a lot of the time, because no one went broke selling arms. And some of the larger, more wealthy universities have large sums of monies in like the billions in terms of what's it called? There's an actual phrase for it. I can't remember what it's called. It's not really important what it's called, but it's essentially the universities can get all this money donated to them by very wealthy people or by corporations, and then they'll have like a building at the university named after them or something like that. Endowments, that's the one. And they can sit on billions in endowments and invest it in their own. And what you get from this sort of neoliberal arrangement, although I'm pretty sure it's been around longer than neoliberalism, but it's massively increased under neoliberalism, is a sort of growing inequality between the sort of elite universities where like all the people from Eton go, and the universities that are not in like the Russell Group or in this country or the Ivy League in the US or whatever. And then you get this growing inequality in the quality of education, since the universities that don't have such a good reputation and don't therefore get the same material resources can't fund the same research, they can't they can't provide the same sort of high quality education.
We're moving towards the American system, which is exactly what it is, because places like Yale and Harvard and all the rest of the large Columbia and rest of them have massive endowments, massive private endowments, and they are to some extent beholden to the people who run the endowment funding, and also of course some. I mean, my own Cambridge College, Trinity, is the wealthiest college in the whole of Oxford,
bloody Oxbridge students.
And they still ring me up. They still ring me up for money. They've got rather more money than I have. I mean, they have. I think they're turnover something like $1 billion or something like that. So they have massive land and property investments, which is lucky for students
that go there.
Trinity. But you're quite right. It's an uneven playing field, and you have universities
it decreases social mobility, that entrenches the already existing class divide. So that's it. Do universities in this country pay taxes?
I think they do, yes.
Yeah, because I remember listening to a thing about...
They have to pay VAT, obviously.
Because I remember listening to a thing about universities in the United States with the example of Yale in particular, which is in New Haven in Connecticut. And Yale doesn't pay any taxes. It's the wealthiest citizen because it's a legal person. It's the wealthiest citizen in the entire city, and it doesn't pay any taxes. So when it uses the services of like the fire service, the police, or whatever, it doesn't pay for that. And yet New Haven is a very poor city, so its poor residents are actually paying for the wealthiest person in inverted commas there. I'm not sure if that's the case in Britain, but
I don't see why they shouldn't pay for the services. But anyway, in the sense that the services are provided, they're not charged.
They're not. I mean, the services are not charged to the individual thing.
Yeah, because you don't have VAT in the States, of course, but you do have sales taxes. But no, I don't think universities in this country pay other than VAT, because they're not classified for tax purposes as private corporations. Although some elements in terms of their research units and stuff like that may well, if they're actually operating as in effect private companies.
Okay. Well, we have about 20 minutes left. So, is there anything else on services, education, healthcare, that sort of thing that you'd like to bring up? Or shall we move on?
I'm trying to think. I think we can move on that. I mean, obviously, social care is an issue, and we need to look at the manifesto to see how they're proposing to handle that. I haven't actually seen that bit.
Okay. So, moving on. Depending on the outcome of the election, and although the polls are not the best at the moment, if somehow miraculously we do get into government, that would be very nice. What should we expect immediately to happen within the first few months? Like by the end of 2017, because there's a certain part of me which is just like a very British coup will actually happen. We'll get assassinated. There'll be mass capital flight. It's all going to be a disaster. But there's the other part of me that's just like, no, that's not going to happen. So what can we expect if a Labour government is elected?
No, I think many of the things which are being proposed, like free school meals, etc., like the money into the health service, increasing the funding of schools, etc. These things can happen anyway relatively quickly. It's not really a problem. And some of that will be investment actually, because certainly in terms of schools and in terms of the health service, for instance, there's capital. There are capital problems as well. I mean, a lot of hospitals have MRI scanners which really need replacement, and they can't afford to do it. School buildings and school equipment is obviously something which needs to be done. So I think a number of these things would be done relatively quickly. The National Investment Bank would take some time to set up, because although we've planned for that in what we've written in terms of the National Investment Bank, in terms of the board structure, roughly who would be how it would be run, etc. We'd have a small team, which might not include me, but possibly would, to set the whole thing up, get the thing moving as quickly as possible, and also avoid recruiting people who don't share our philosophy. That's
probably a good idea.
That's the other problem. That is a problem, but it can be got around. I mean, in terms of we don't want people who. I mean, to some extent, you're going to have people who've been brought up within the current banking sector, but there are some of those who have hold rather more reactionary views than others. So you try and eliminate that. So some of these things can be done. I don't see a problem that the first year would be spent preparing things, increasing funding. We need to start investing in infrastructure and and doing that fairly quickly, because it's growth that we need. I mean,
growth in the real economic sectors.
Growth in terms of wage-led growth. That's the other thing that the government keeps prattling on. And I mean, I notice unemployment has come down again.
Yeah,
so we have employment.
That was on the BBC this afternoon. It was on BBC News at 1:00. They said, wages have gone up on average by 2.1%. I'm just like, that's really disingenuous, because I read just yesterday the top 1% wages have gone up by 14% in a year, and the bottom 60% have declined by 10% over the last decade.
Exactly.
So
if you just take a mean in
the
terms
average,
of the average,
terrible.
then you would get it wrong. If you take the median person in work, then it hasn't gone up. And in fact, wages are stagnating, and that's the problem. If you have higher wages and releasing the totally unnecessary constraint on public sector pay, if you increase wages, you've got growth. You have wage-led growth. Tax revenues increase. That's the point. Ironically, I heard Fallon, in terms of he was defending increased expenditure on defence. He was actually said something which I wish Labour spokesmen would say, which is that if we have growth and therefore tax revenues are increasing, therefore we can afford to spend more on defence. Now,
you could spend it on something that's actually useful.
Well, I mean,
defence is
needed.
But
the point he's making is correct in economic terms, and we're not saying that. Unfortunately, we're not saying it. If we are, we're not saying it loudly enough. It's something that I was working with John McDonnell in terms of messaging before this election, totally unnecessary election, was announced. So I obviously hadn't had a chance to do that. And that was one of the points I was making. We mustn't be stuck in this static view that every piece of expenditure has to be matched by a tax increase. And that's precisely what we've done. Oh, we can do that, but we also must suggest that if we have proper wage-led growth, then tax revenues will increase. We'll have more money to spend on current expenditure.
Yes, and because wage-led growth, creates aggregate demand, which allows the economy to flow. So it's not radical; it's just basic.
No,
it's
just
basic
bloody
Keynesianism. This was the norm for like most of the last century. So,
and also we need to stop worrying about the public debt. Public debt doesn't matter.
Where did this obsession come from about public debt? I mean, there's part of me that obviously there's part of it is purely ideological and opportunist from the right wing political perspective, but part of it must be actually some people actually do believe this in positions of power and authority within the state. I'm just like, how? Why? Where did this come from?
Well, it's one of the neoliberal legs of the neoliberal argument, because it's about it's accompanied by austerity, which reduces the size of the state effectively. I mean, haven't been very good at it, the Conservative government, but that's basically what it's aimed at. In fact, if you look at some of the speeches, I mean, David Cameron made a speech in 2013 where it was absolutely clear he was talking about he said a permanent reduction in the size of the state. Anybody who doesn't think that they're dealing with neoliberalism needs to actually look at that speech and other speeches fairly carefully, and that's the problem. You're right, neoliberalism. Well, the problem with neoliberalism, as again I explain in the book,
not plugging this at all.
We're not including this at all. Is that its antecedent is liberal individualism, with the accent on individualism, and that's the problem. We've got a situation where neoliberalism simply adds the market to the notion of liberal individualism. That's effectively what happens. So the market drives us even further into our individual, familial and individual silos, and we compete against each other, and that is seen as a good thing. The market works. In fact,
no, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
All markets fail. End of story.
But the market will be efficient. Yeah, okay. You tell me that's efficient when we produce enough food for 9 or 10 billion people. We have 7 billion and 2 billion go hungry. Efficiency. Voila. So yeah, bringing all of what we've talked about in terms of Labour economic policy together, how does this relate to what Labour would be arguing for in terms of Brexit negotiations and trade with Europe?
Yeah, I think one of the things that worries me slightly is we should be saying that if Brexit occurs, it will be damaging.
Yeah,
There's no use pretending that it won't be. Now, we seem to be stuck and not willing to say that. The point is, it will be damaging. Whatever deal is accepted, even if you got a European Economic Area deal, you're talking probably about round about 5% GDP less than it would otherwise be. So even the best possible, and there is the best possible deal, the best possible deal will not actually mean that we're not going to have lower national income that we would otherwise have. What I've suggested and what I've tried to convince the Labour Party to say is that only Labour Party policies can actually help in terms of ameliorating the damage that will be done by Brexit. Because the idea that all this is going to be sorted out in 2 years or 18 months, it's going to be now effectively, is simply nonsense. It will not happen. And it's not a question of the rest of the EU being nasty to us or punishing us.
Oh yeah, it's not that.
It's just the nature of things that we will be a third country. and we can't even start negotiating with anybody, including the EU, until we've left. And leaving is not going to be costless, because there will be liabilities which we have to meet, and we've said we will meet them. The level is not clear. Maybe 30 billion, whatever, over a period. So it's not that substantial in the scheme of things, but it will be resisted, of course. Even guaranteeing rights to EU citizens living here is not a simple matter, because it's a matter of their families, it's a matter of their pension rights, it's a matter of what, you're talking about 3 million people. It's not going to be easy to sort that out. We have a different, and the EU is arguing that those rights must be guaranteed, if necessary, by the European Court of Justice. So, these things are not simple matters at all, and it'll take some discussion. They're not negotiations. The Article 50 discussions are about technical and legal issues. The border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, etc. And the other things I've mentioned. These are technical legal issues. That's the approach that the EU is adopting. This David Davis, Theresa May nonsense. Well, we're going to be tough. No, sorry. This is about legality and technicality. This is not about
their idea of tough and strong and stable negotiations is basically a small child crying because it wants a lolly in a shop.
It's appalling. So I think we must understand that this is going to be damaging. There's a sense in which sometimes when Jeremy talks about it that we are, and also it is completely untrue that the people took a decision to leave. They did not, actually.
Yeah,
Parliament has taken the decision to invoke Article 50. It was an advisory referendum. The Parliament did not surrender sovereignty to the people, actually. And even if it did, it can take it back at any time. I don't agree with the second referendum. I don't agree with the referenda. Period. This is not democracy. This is mob rule, effectively, particularly with a media that distorts pretty well everything, as we can see from the attacks on Corbyn and the Labour Party. So, no, it's for Parliament to take that decision. And as we approach the end of the Article 50 negotiations, it should become plain that what we're doing is moving into a very, very dangerous situation which should be avoided. And it's up to MPs to decide what they want to do. If we do leave, as I say, my view is that only with the sort of policies that the Labour Party is putting forward in terms of growth and development and investment and the rest of it is going to be the way out of the problems which will occur and the damage, economic damage, which will happen.
Yeah, I suppose, because I remember hearing McDonnell talk about that, yes, Brexit will be terribly damaging to our economy, but there are at least some perhaps positive opportunities that could come out of it in terms of being, to a certain degree, independent or autonomous of European legislation regarding like tariffs and protectionism and competition laws is what that's the one. Which was essentially the Lexit argument, which I don't fully agree with. But the Lexit argument, or left exit argument, was basically, the EU, it's this competition-based neoliberal institution, which they're right that it is, but given the context of Brexit, I would have rather stayed. But McDonnell said, okay, we can use this as an opportunity to bring about state-led investment, state-led growth, and to invest in new sectors where we couldn't compete before with, so say we couldn't compete with exports coming from Europe into our country, where depending on the form of Brexit, if we're going to get a trade deal with access to the common market, then we probably wouldn't be able to just put up protectionist tariff barriers and say, go away, we're going to invest in our own car manufacturing or whatever else, and that sort of thing. But I can't remember exactly what McDonnell said, but he said something to that effect.
Well, obviously there will be some opportunities, and there will be things that we can do. We're not in a collapse. That's quite clear. But what I'm arguing is it will take at least 10 years to actually get back where we would
It's a
have been if
long-term
we'd not
thing.
left. And the argument about public ownership, I mean, there's public ownership in all the EU countries and substantially in some of the countries. And KfW as a state investment bank is perfectly okay in terms of the EU state aid rules. So the point about the EU from a sort of political left perspective is it's a battleground. It's neither totally in the hands of neoliberals, nor is it clearly totally in the hands of the left. It's a battleground. It always has been a battleground. But anybody who thinks you can have socialism in one country is living in dreamland. And particularly in this country is probably has probably the most right-wing electorate, partly because they've been conditioned by the media and by the kind of neoliberal establishment, if you like, people. And when I say neoliberal establishment, these are not evil people. These are people who've swallowed this idea of liberal individualism and market capitalism. They're not evil people.
They're just misguided.
They're just misguided. Leave it there. Yes, definitely misguided.
Yes. We have 10 minutes left. So, completely detached from everything that we've just discussed, in terms of innovation and like sort of new emerging economic sectors with the sort of fourth industrial revolution sort of idea, there are a few things that I find particularly interesting that we could invest in terms of combating climate change, or not necessarily. I think it's probably too far gone at this point to reverse climate change or avert it. So it's more or less, how do we minimize its effects, and how do we like make sure that we don't all die, and things like, and also moving towards an economy where we could have less work, maybe 6-hour day, less intense work through automation, things like that, ultimately leading to the utopia that is fully automated luxury communism, which I cannot go an episode without saying. It is the best meme. So yeah, what do you think of the sorts of innovations in technology to displace work, displace human labour from large sections of the economy, where in the past the introduction of new machines, so mechanization, and then the introduction of like the assembly line and so on, this has always led to the creation of new jobs. But it seems like in this industrial revolution that it's going to destroy more jobs than it creates. And it's almost, there was the analogy that CGP Grey comes up with, and he's made a YouTube video about automation, where think about it from the perspective of a horse in 1914 when cars were a newfangled thing. Back then you could probably say, oh no, we'll find other things for horses to do that they can't yet envisage. But with hindsight, that's silly. Horses don't have jobs anymore because they are not employable. They can't do anything to earn their upkeep. So the horse population peaked in 1914 or 15 at some point. And since then it's just been all the way down because cars just replaced them in practically everything. If it's unclear as of yet, but if like AI and automation comes along and basically it can replace humans from, the sort of muscle-driven manufacturing, and then also from a lot of services, and also possibly from a lot of professional jobs, even if it renders not even all of the population. Current projections are that something like 45% of jobs could be eliminated with automation. The unemployment rate in the Great Depression was 25%. If 45% of the people were unemployed, and we still had this economic model, that would be completely disastrous. So, what do you think of the sort of
I agree entirely.
Technologies and so on?
Well, as you know, I made the speech at the Newcastle, the Regional Economic Conference on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. My view is very much like yours, that although in the past new jobs have been created, the likelihood is we have up to 50% of jobs over the next 20 years which will disappear. Now, those jobs are going to be in services as well as in manufacturing. In fact, much less in manufacturing. In this country, it's going to be in services because 80% by employment of the GDP is in services. And this means it is not going to be possible to generate new jobs. There were some new jobs generated, that's clear. But because most of the new jobs were, in the past, have tended to be, although some have been in other sort of manufacturing jobs, a number of them have been in services. And this is not going to happen once automation, AI, etc., starts impacting on services in a very big way. It's not a problem of itself, because all you have to do, I say all you have to do is adjust the balance between work, leisure, and income. So that if we let's assume we all work 3 days a week, then obviously we've got 4 days a week of leisure. There's not much point in having that leisure if you don't have the money to be able to utilize that leisure. Oh, okay. Some people want to play games, some people want to watch the television, but and that's up to people to choose. But I mean, they should at least have the wherewithal to do, to live comfortably, because we're generating national income, we're increasing the GDP because of automation, and that needs to be distributed in ways which enable people to work less, have more leisure, and have more income to enjoy that leisure. I like to quote the statistic that from 1900 to 1950 in this country, we took a third of the increase in productivity in the form of leisure. But since then, that's stopped happening. So I entirely agree with you that the future means we have to think very clearly about how we manage our economy in the way that I suggested, in terms of who works and how long they work, what leisure they have, and what income they have. You will not get a neoliberal Tory government to be able to deal with that. Only a socialist government, in my view.
Yeah, I think
talked about a Labour government. Only a socialist government will be able.
It's basically what Paul Mason outlines, and I know you disagree with his main thesis, but it's essentially the generalised two future conceptions. Either we degenerate into neo-feudalism and like the 8 people who own half the world's wealth will own all of it, according to the Oxfam report from January, or we get some sort of post-capitalism, and it's basically Star Trek, but without warp drive and Vulcans. Yeah. So that's that. And in terms
my disagreement with Paul is basically we're not there yet. He seems to think we're almost there, and I don't think that's true. I think there's a long way to go yet.
Yeah, there's a long way to. I mean, he cites digital abundance in terms of copy and paste. We can basically just create things that are digitally produced, basically infinitely, which is correct. But we're not there with physical goods and services that you actually need to make out of things that you dig out the ground.
Exactly. You can design things.
Although we are getting there, and actually this links nicely, because
with graphene,
I was going to talk about not just graphene, but in terms of, so one of the big concerns with climate change is not just that we're destroying the atmosphere and then acidifying the oceans, destroying the food chain, but we're actually going to run out of oil and things like this, and natural resources, but and food as well, because climate change will very much disrupt the food supply. But a lot of new emerging technologies in terms of things like vertical farming, and I know there is research going on, but that it's not there yet in terms of we can already take plant matter and like algae and other sorts of things like this, and then do complex chemistry processes that I don't understand because I'm not a chemist, to make them into biofuels. Biofuel, it's essentially the same sort of process, I would think, to polymerization. If you could then get the biofuel and polymerize it into plastics, you've basically got a renewable supply of plastics. If we could get there, the science isn't there yet. That's a
we have to find a way of disposing of plastic properly.
Well, this is true.
Not leaving them dumped in the ocean and floating around in the South Pacific.
But things like that, and like if we could make...
I think the problem with some people have with an argument I have with the Greens on climate change is they are technological pessimists. I'm a technological optimist.
I think we can use technology to fix things.
It's how you use it, how you manage it. Just as
I mean, in terms of, we can basically secure the food supply through vertical agriculture if we build the infrastructure up to enough of a scale.
We need insects.
Or we could do that, but I'd rather not. I mean, once we can get a renewable energy infrastructure to a large enough scale, and provided the maintenance is done, we can basically do electrolysis of seawater to get an infinite supply of free clean water. And then if we get biofuels built on a large enough scale, you've basically solved your entire aviation fuel problem, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of technological fixes. It's just the infrastructure.
If technology helps us to stop damaging, continuing to damage the climate and the natural environment, then the natural environment will recover. The Earth will not die. We may.
We might see a global extinction event, but it's not going to be everything. It's not going to be like we're destroying the entire surface. It's not going to be nuclear weapons.
I think the planet will last a lot longer than we will.
Yes, definitely.
Put it that way. That's what I'm saying. When people talk about destroying the planet, I think that's just complete nonsense. We may destroy ourselves, and that might be a help to the planet, but we won't destroy the planet.
Yeah. We'll just have to make sure we set up a moon base first, and then we'll.
No, I don't want us to destroy ourselves. I want us to change and be the sort of human population that we can be, without being infected.
We're still coming out of the dark ages right now, so maybe we'll get enlightenment in a century or two.
We need a new enlightenment.
Yes,
which is in my book. I'm sorry, I had to get that one in.
Yes, and we're actually at 1 hour and 30 minutes, so we'll bring it to a close. Thank you, Michael. Everyone can go and buy Michael's book, The Revolution of Civil Society, Challenging Neoliberal Orthodoxy, The Development of the Progressive State, which is a ridiculously long academic title. You're all the same, you academics. So go buy that. Is there anywhere they can get it?
They can get it either the paperback community, if they go directly to Lulu. That sounds Lulu. It's a stateside printer, publisher printer, or they can buy the electronic version on Amazon, the Kindle version, for $1.99.
All right then.
Priced for students.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. That'll be all for this week. Thank you for listening to Red Talks. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.